The store was empty, silent, and cold. The last few customers had trickled out hours ago, their footsteps echoing through the long aisles as they made their way to the exit. The dull hum of the overhead fluorescent lights filled the air, their flickering creating an unsettling rhythm that reverberated throughout the store. A lone figure moved in the far corner, methodically sweeping the aisles and checking the shelves, preparing for the end of the shift. The clock on the wall ticked down the final minutes until the doors would close. It was supposed to be just another night of work, another mundane closing shift, but tonight felt different. Something hung in the air. An energy that felt wrong, out of place. Evelyn, the closing shift worker, ran her hand over the register counter, wiping away the dust that had accumulated throughout the day. Her gaze shifted towards the darkened store as she glanced through the large windows. The parking lot outside was deserted, the once bustling streets now quiet in the late-night hours. A shiver ran down her spine, and she glanced over her shoulder, as if expecting someone, or something, to be standing right behind her. She quickly shook off the sensation, taking a deep breath to steady herself. It had been a long shift, and she was exhausted. The closing routine was always the same, and she had done it 100 times before. Lock the doors, turn off the lights, check the security systems, and head out. It wasn't difficult. But tonight, the air felt thick, suffocating almost, and she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. As she made her way to the back of the store to start closing the stockroom, she noticed the faint sound of something shifting behind her. She turned quickly, heart hammering in her chest, only to find that the store was still as empty as it had been just moments before. No one was there. It must have been the wind, she thought. Just the wind. But even as she tried to convince herself of that, the unease deepened, settling like a cold weight in the pit of her stomach. She continued on with her tasks, checking the shelves one by one and ensuring everything was in place. The familiar routine was meant to ease her mind, to give her something to focus on besides the growing sense of dread that seemed to seep into the very walls of the store. But the unease refused to dissipate. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the overhead lights, seemed amplified in the silence. The store, which had once been filled with the sounds of customers and co-workers, now felt like an empty, lifeless shell. As Evelyn entered the back room, the air was suddenly colder, the temperature dropping without explanation. The freezer door was slightly ajar, and she reached out to close it, the chill from within sending a shiver up her spine. She paused for a moment, staring into the dark abyss of the freezer, wondering if she had imagined the cold or if there was something more to it. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she quickly slammed the door shut, not wanting to linger any longer than necessary. The store's security system beeped as she entered the office to check the cameras, making sure everything was secure before locking the doors. The small screen flickered to life, and she scanned the footage of the empty store. The aisles were still, the shelves perfectly in place. No movement. Everything seemed fine. But then, a strange flicker on one of the cameras caught her eye. For a split second, the image distorted, showing a dark figure standing at the far end of an aisle. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the screen, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure was just a shadow, no details, no features, just a dark outline in the dim light of the store. It couldn't be anyone. There were no other employees working the shift. No customers. And yet, there it was. She blinked rapidly, hoping that the image would disappear, but it stayed. The figure didn't move, didn't shift. It simply stood there, motionless. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the phone to call for help, but she stopped herself. Who would she call? The police wouldn't be able to do anything. She was alone. The only person in the building. Her gaze shifted to the camera feed again, but the figure was gone. The screen now showed an empty aisle, the faint hum of the lights the only sound breaking the silence. Her pulse raced as she felt her stomach churn, the tight knot of dread in her chest growing larger. This was ridiculous, she told herself. It was just a glitch. A malfunction in the cameras. Nothing more. She had to finish the shift and leave. But even as she told herself this, her instincts told her to leave now, to lock the doors and never look back. She stood there for a moment, the weight of the silence pressing in on her. The thought of staying in the store any longer, locked in after hours, seemed unbearable. The idea of the dark figure, standing motionless, waiting, crept into her mind like a spider weaving a web in the corners of her consciousness. She shook her head, trying to dispel the thought. Just finished the shift, she reminded herself. The doors were locked, and the store was secure. There was no reason to be afraid. Nothing to fear. But then, a sudden sound broke the silence. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, a faint tapping, like someone knocking gently on the walls. Evelyn's body went rigid, every muscle tensed. She turned towards the sound, her breath shallow as her eyes darted around the dark store. She could hear it now, distinct and steady, a rhythmic tapping, coming from somewhere deeper within the store. It was a strange, unsettling sound, echoing through the empty aisles like a distant drumbeat. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It bounced off the walls, reverberating through the aisles, growing louder with every passing second. She tried to convince herself that it was just a pipe, an old building settling, but the sound was unmistakable. It was too deliberate. Too purposeful. Evelyn hesitated, unsure whether to investigate or lock herself in the office and wait for the night to end. But the curiosity, the need to know what was happening, won out. She grabbed the flashlight from the desk and crept out of the office, moving silently through the dark store. The tapping grew louder, more urgent, as she followed the sound towards the back of the store, toward the storage room. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up again as she stepped closer to the room. The door was slightly ajar, and as she pushed it open, the tapping stopped. The sudden silence hit her like a physical blow. The air in the storage room felt thick, suffocating. It was cold, the temperature plummeting even more than before. And then she saw it. At the far end of the room, something was moving. A figure, no longer just a shadow, but an indistinct shape that seemed to shift in the darkness. It was standing still, but the presence was undeniable. Evelyn's pulse quickened, and her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. And then, the figure moved. It darted forward in a blur of motion, too fast for her to comprehend, and Evelyn screamed, her voice cutting through the silence of the store. She stumbled backward, her foot catching on a box, sending it crashing to the floor. The sound was deafening in the otherwise silent room, and for a moment, she thought she might be dreaming. But the cold, the fear, the terror gripping her heart were all too real. The figure was gone. Just like that. Vanished into the shadows. But Evelyn wasn't alone. She wasn't alone anymore. The night was thick with a strange tension, one that clung to the air like a heavy fog. Rob had been working security at this run-down, almost forgotten strip mall for over a month now, and although the place was far from glamorous, it had always been predictable. The familiar buzz of the store lights, the occasional shuffle of a rat in the walls, the dead silence that enveloped the complex once the last employee left, it was all part of the routine. But tonight, something felt different. The stillness wasn't quite as calm. The lights flickered a little too much, and the shadows in the corners of the store seemed to stretch longer, as if they had a life of their own. It was just a typical Tuesday evening, or so he had thought. The stores had closed, and Rob was now doing his rounds. He had already passed by the empty coffee shop and the convenience store with its metal gates half closed. The cleaning crew would be gone by now, and the parking lot outside was nearly empty, save for a few straggling cars that had no business being there. Rob's heavy boots echoed on the tile floor as he walked through the dark, cavernous hallways of the mall. His flashlight cut through the shadows, and the faint buzzing of the dim overhead lights was the only sound breaking the silence. The only movement came from the faint hum of the security cameras swiveling above him, their mechanical whirring a constant reminder of his solitary task. Checking the cameras, walking the aisles, making sure no one was hiding in the stores after hours. He passed the jewelry store, where the thick glass windows were now completely dark. There were no lights left on inside, just reflections of the empty corridor in the glass. For a moment, he thought he saw something move in the reflection, just a blur, but enough to make his pulse quicken. He shook it off. It was probably just the security light flickering in the distance. A trick of the eyes. But then, as he passed by the next store, the unmistakable sound of a footstep echoed behind him. Rob froze, his breath caught in his throat. He quickly spun around, the beam of his flashlight slicing through the darkness. But the hallway behind him was empty. Not a soul in sight. The sharp clatter of his own heartbeat was deafening in his ears as he scanned the area. His eyes darted down the long, empty corridors, waiting for something, or someone, to appear. Nothing. He exhaled slowly, trying to laugh off the tension. It was just a shadow. He had been walking alone through this mall for weeks, and this was the first time he had felt this uneasy. Maybe it was the silence playing tricks on him. Maybe the isolation was getting to him. "Get a grip, Rob," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. But his feet didn't feel as steady as they usually did as he continued his rounds. He checked the back doors of the stores, the locked gates that had no business being opened at this hour. Everything was in place, as it always was. No one had broken in, no one was hiding. The mall was as dead as it ever was after hours. But then he heard it again. The sound of footsteps. But this time, they were closer. Rob's hand instinctively reached for his walkie-talkie, but something stopped him. His grip tightened around it, his thumb pressing down on the button, but he didn't speak. The thought of calling the manager or another guard seemed foolish. Why would there be anyone else here? The whole place had been empty when he arrived. It was just him. Alone. He moved cautiously now, each step slower than the last. His flashlight illuminated the floor in front of him, casting long, exaggerated shadows on the walls. His pulse thudded in his ears, a rhythm that matched the uncertainty clawing at his mind. The footsteps grew louder. This time, Rob didn't turn around. His instincts told him that if he looked back, he wouldn't like what he saw. There was something about the way the footsteps moved, slow, methodical, as if the person behind him wasn't in any rush to confront him. The pacing was uneven, almost as if someone was trying to remain hidden, watching from the darkness. Rob turned a corner, hoping to shake the feeling that he was being followed. The sound of the footsteps didn't stop. They didn't change. They continued behind him, like a mirror, matching his every move. Suddenly, he stopped dead in his tracks. The footsteps had ceased. For a moment, everything was still. The faint buzz of the lights above, the humming of the air conditioning, the quiet murmur of his breath, it was all he could hear. Rob's stomach knotted. He knew something was wrong. Something had changed in the air. The oppressive silence weighed down on him, thick and suffocating. He checked the security cameras again, quickly glancing at the small screen in his hand. The dark hallways were still, the dim light revealing nothing but empty storefronts. No movement. No signs of life. But when he looked closer, the cameras at the far end of the corridor flickered. A distortion. A black blur appeared for just a moment, too fast to identify, before vanishing again. "Goddamn," Rob muttered, wiping the sweat from his brow. The distortion had to be a glitch. It had to be. The cameras had been malfunctioning lately. The fact that it happened at the end of the hall, where the security lighting was low, didn't help matters. But the longer he stared at the screen, the more uneasy he became. The glitch had been too deliberate. Too real. He tried shaking off the feeling, but as he looked down the hallway, he could have sworn he saw a figure standing just at the edge of his vision. It wasn't clear, just a shadowy outline, too vague to make out, but it was there, and it was enough to send his heart racing. The footsteps started again. This time, they were moving faster, closer. Rob turned to face the sound. The flashlight in his hand trembled. He knew it was impossible, that it couldn't be happening, but the footsteps were unmistakable now. They were right behind him. He spun around, his flashlight illuminating the empty hallway, but there was no one there. Nothing but darkness. And yet, he could feel it, something watching him from the shadows. Something breathing, waiting. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. His mind raced. He needed to get out of there. But his legs felt heavy, as though they were frozen to the floor. Every instinct in his body screamed for him to run, to find the nearest exit and escape this place before it swallowed him whole. Rob's flashlight flickered as he backed away from the sound, the beam cutting through the darkness like a sword. It was only when he reached the end of the hallway that the footsteps stopped. A silence so profound it felt unnatural enveloped him. His breath came in ragged gasps, the sound of his own heart thumping against his chest too loud in the stillness. And then, as if it had never been there at all, the sound of the footsteps was gone. But Rob knew it wasn't over. Whatever was following him wasn't finished. A dark figure appeared at the far end of the corridor. This time, it wasn't a distortion. It wasn't a trick of the light. The figure stepped forward, its form becoming clearer with each passing second. Rob's breath caught in his throat. The figure was tall, its shape vaguely human, but there was something wrong about it, something that made Rob's blood run cold. The shadows seemed to twist and coil around it like living things. The air grew colder, heavier, as if the very room itself had turned against him. Rob's legs finally broke free from their frozen state, and he turned to run, his footsteps pounding against the floor as he bolted for the exit. But before he could take more than 2 steps, the lights above him flickered out completely. In the pitch blackness, a voice, low and almost indecipherable, echoed through the hallway. "You can't leave." And in the darkness, Rob realized he never would. Lena's heart was pounding in her chest, each beat echoing in the hollow silence of the store as she made her way down the aisle, one slow step after another. The night had been uneventful up until now, just the usual late-night closing shift. The store had emptied out long ago, the last few customers leaving just before the clock hit 9. The only sounds now were the faint hum of the air conditioning and the occasional clink of the shopping carts moving as she pushed them into the back room. But there was something unsettling in the air, a tension she couldn't explain. Her footsteps echoed unnervingly in the empty store as she walked past rows of shelves, the fluorescent lights above flickering intermittently, casting a cold, almost ghostly light across the aisles. The shadows seemed longer, darker than usual, as if the night was stretching itself into something far more oppressive. She kept glancing over her shoulder, though she told herself it was just nerves. It wasn't uncommon for the store to feel this empty once it was closed for the night. But tonight, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She made her way toward the front of the store, pulling the last few stray carts into the designated area by the entrance. The echo of the wheels against the floor seemed louder than usual. Each little sound amplified in the stillness, filling the space with a kind of anxious energy. Her fingers brushed the edge of the cold metal frame of the carts, and the chill from the steel seemed to seep into her skin, making her shiver despite the warm air inside the building. The air conditioning kicked on again, its deep mechanical hum reverberating through the empty aisles, but it didn't quite mask the other sounds that seemed to be coming from deeper within the store. There was a rustling sound now, as if something, or someone, was moving, but when Lena turned to look, the aisles were as empty as ever. The sound wasn't constant, but it was there, echoing through the stillness, so faint she wasn't sure if she was hearing it at all or if her mind was playing tricks on her. She paused, a chill crawling up her spine. She had worked here for almost a year and had never felt this way before. Sure, she'd heard the occasional creaks and groans of the old building settling, but this felt different. This felt like something, or someone, was moving around, just out of sight. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Maybe it was just her imagination. Maybe it was the long hours catching up with her. But something about the silence, the eerie stillness of the store, made her feel like she wasn't as alone as she thought. Lena glanced around again, her breath catching in her throat. She was used to the solitude of the late-night shifts, but the feeling that someone else was there, watching her, was unnerving. It wasn't a physical presence she could see, but it was as though something was lurking just beyond her line of sight, waiting for her to turn around. She shook her head, trying to clear the unsettling thoughts. No. She was just being paranoid. The store was empty. It was just a few more hours until the night ended, and then she could go home and put all of this behind her. But as she reached for the set of keys on her belt, she heard it again. A soft rustling sound, coming from the far end of the aisle she was facing. This time, it was louder. Almost deliberate. Her stomach twisted with a sudden, sharp surge of unease. She looked up, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the aisle was still empty. The shelves were stacked neatly, the products aligned just as they had been when she first started the shift. Her mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe it was just the air conditioning again. Maybe a box had fallen from the shelf. But no, this was something else. Something that made her feel like there was no logical explanation at all. She stepped back, her eyes scanning the shelves once more, her grip tightening around the cart she had been pushing. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, something with eyes that followed her every move. Her breathing grew shallow, quick. She took a step back, ready to retreat into the security of the back office. Just then, something caught her eye, a shadow, flitting across the aisle like a flicker of movement in the corner of her vision. She froze. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled, her blood running cold. The shadow had been too quick, too fast for her to see clearly, but she knew she wasn't imagining it. There was someone here. Her hands trembled as she gripped the cart harder, almost as if it was the only thing anchoring her to reality. She took another step back, her eyes darting across the store, searching for any sign of movement, any indication that someone had entered without her noticing. But nothing. For a moment, the only sound in the store was her own ragged breathing and the distant hum of the air conditioning. Her pulse was racing, her heart hammering in her chest as she slowly backed toward the entrance, her eyes never leaving the aisles. The store had grown deathly quiet again, as though nothing had happened, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The sensation of being watched had only intensified. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, like a creeping presence just out of sight. Lena's mind was racing now, a whirlwind of possibilities and scenarios. Had someone broken in? Had one of the other employees left something behind? No. No one was supposed to be here. She was alone in the store. She had checked the cameras earlier, and everything had looked fine. But the feeling of being watched, being stalked, hadn't disappeared. It had only grown stronger. She reached for her walkie-talkie, ready to call for help, but her hand hesitated just before she pressed the button. What would she say? That she thought someone was in the store with her? That she was hearing things, seeing shadows? It sounded insane. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was someone else in the store, someone, or something, that was hiding just out of her sight, playing a game of cat and mouse. Her eyes flicked back to the end of the aisle, and there it was again, another shadow, this time more distinct, more defined. It moved quickly, just out of her reach, vanishing into the corner of her vision before she could fully process it. Her pulse quickened, and the panic that had been simmering beneath the surface finally broke free. She turned and started to walk quickly toward the back office, not caring about the carts or the mess she was leaving behind. She had to get out. She had to lock herself away where she would be safe. But before she could reach the back room, the lights overhead flickered violently, plunging the store into darkness for a split second before coming back on. The eerie, mechanical hum of the lights was louder now, almost deafening, and the shadows in the aisles seemed to stretch, warping and twisting in unnatural ways. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the shadow moved again, closer this time. Right at the edge of her vision. But it was no longer just a blur. It had a form now. A shape. Something tall, thin, and unmistakably human, standing in the darkness of the aisle. But when Lena turned her head fully to face it, it was gone. She could feel it now. The unmistakable weight of eyes on her. Watching, waiting. Her breath hitched in her throat as she turned to look back at the aisle. There was nothing there, no person, no shadow. Just the empty, sterile rows of shelves. But it didn't matter. Lena knew she had seen something. She knew someone, or something, had been standing there, watching her. And now, it was following her. The storage room door creaked open, the sound sharp against the thick silence that had descended over the store. Nora hesitated at the threshold, her body tense with the weight of the unsettling atmosphere that had filled the building since the moment she stepped into her shift that evening. The dim light from the hallway spilled into the room, casting long shadows on the cluttered shelves and creating a jagged silhouette of the forgotten stock that seemed to have gathered dust for years. She had been avoiding the storage room all night, knowing that the last thing she wanted was to get caught in the back of the store alone, surrounded by nothing but boxes, forgotten items, and an unnerving stillness. But now, as she stood there, the air felt thick with something else, something beyond the ordinary fear of working alone after hours. It was the kind of tension that seemed to hang in the air, like a storm waiting to break, and it made her skin crawl. Taking a deep breath, Nora stepped inside, the door groaning as it closed behind her. She glanced around, noticing the dust motes swirling in the faint beam of light, the smell of aged cardboard and old plastic filling her nostrils. The place was a maze of shelves stacked high with boxes, each one filled with items that hadn't seen the light of day in who knew how long. It was easy to get lost back here, and she often did when trying to organize the shelves, but tonight felt different. Tonight, the shadows in the room felt deeper, the silence heavier. As she moved deeper into the room, she adjusted the straps of her apron and looked around, grabbing the first box she could find, prepared to begin the tedious task of sorting through the inventory. But the moment she touched the box, she froze. A soft sound came from the far corner of the room, barely audible, but unmistakable. It was a scraping noise, as if something was moving across the floor, dragging slowly behind it. Nora's heart skipped a beat, and she stood motionless for a moment, trying to convince herself that it was just the wind or the building settling. But the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, more distinct, until it was a rhythmic dragging, unmistakable and unsettling. Nora's breath caught in her throat, her hands trembling as she clutched the box, too afraid to turn around and face whatever was in the room with her. Her mind raced, trying to think of any logical explanation for the noise. Was it an animal? Maybe a rodent, trying to scurry across the floor unnoticed? But the dragging was too deliberate, too methodical. It was a slow, purposeful motion, like someone or something was moving with intent. She slowly set the box down on the floor, her movements deliberate as she tried to quiet the pounding of her heart. She tried to convince herself that it was nothing, that she was simply imagining things, but she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. The noise continued, growing louder with each passing second. It was coming closer now, dragging across the floor in a slow, agonizing rhythm. She turned her head, slowly, her gaze flicking to the corner of the room where the noise seemed to be coming from. The darkness there seemed almost unnatural, as though the shadows themselves were pulling away from the light, swallowing it whole. Nora strained her eyes, searching for any sign of movement, any glimpse of something that would explain what she was hearing. But there was nothing, just the oppressive darkness and the faint sound of dragging, closer now, right behind her. Her pulse quickened as she began to move, taking small, tentative steps backward toward the door. The scraping sound followed her, inching closer, but she refused to look. She couldn't bring herself to turn around fully. There was something about that corner, that darkness, that seemed to draw her gaze in but also repelled her in equal measure. She felt as though if she looked too long, she might see something she wasn't supposed to see, something that would confirm the worst of her fears. But every step she took toward the door only seemed to make the noise grow louder, more insistent. Nora's breath was coming faster now, each inhalation shallow and quick. She was almost at the door, just a few feet away, but it felt like an eternity. The scraping sound had stopped, replaced now by something else, whispers, soft and indecipherable, as though voices were murmuring from just beyond her reach. Her blood ran cold. She had heard them earlier, faint whispers that had seemed to come from nowhere, but she hadn't been able to pinpoint their source. Now, they were clearer, closer. She could feel them pressing against her ears, filling her head with 1,000 disjointed words that she couldn't quite understand. The air around her grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. She could feel it now, something was in the room with her, something that didn't belong, something that was watching, waiting. In a blind panic, Nora grabbed the door handle and yanked it open, not caring about the noise, not caring about the security of the store. She needed to get out, needed to escape whatever was lurking in the shadows. But as soon as the door swung open, she stopped in her tracks. There, just on the other side of the threshold, stood a figure. Its form was blurred, indistinct, like a dark shadow cast against the dim light of the hallway. Nora's heart skipped a beat, and she stepped back instinctively, her pulse racing. The figure didn't move, it just stood there, its outline shifting ever so slightly, like it was made of the very darkness around it. There was no face, no features to speak of, just an impenetrable silhouette that seemed to defy the dim light spilling from the hallway. For a moment, Nora couldn't breathe. The air seemed to freeze around her, the world narrowing to just the figure and her, trapped in an unspoken confrontation. Her mind screamed at her to run, to push past it and escape, but her feet wouldn't move. She was paralyzed, caught in the gaze of something she couldn't understand, something that felt ancient and wrong, something that should not exist. The figure didn't speak, didn't make a sound. It didn't need to. Its presence was enough to send a chill through Nora's entire being, enough to make her feel small, insignificant, like a mere insect caught in a web. Her breath quickened again, and this time, her body obeyed her instincts. She forced herself to take a step backward, then another, until she was backing into the storage room once again, the door slamming shut behind her. But even as she retreated, she could still feel the presence of the figure just outside. It was like it was there, pressing against the door, just beyond her reach. And that was the worst part, that she couldn't escape it, that no matter how far she ran, no matter how much she closed herself off from it, it would always be there, waiting. The store was still. Too still. The whispers had stopped. The dragging had stopped. It was all silent now, but Nora knew the silence wasn't comforting. It was the kind of silence that came before the storm, the kind of silence that preceded something far worse than what she could imagine. She could still hear her own breathing, shallow and quick, her heart pounding in her chest like a drum. But she wasn't alone. She had never been alone in that room. And that knowledge, that cold, unshakable certainty, made her blood run cold. The door behind her rattled suddenly, a sharp jolt that made her freeze. She didn't dare turn around. The figure was still out there, she was sure of it. It was just waiting, biding its time, letting her think she had a chance to escape. But there was no escape. There was nowhere to run. Elliot had always been a night owl, someone who thrived in the quiet hours after the world had gone to sleep. There was something peaceful about the solitude, something that allowed him to clear his mind and focus on the tasks at hand without the distractions of the daytime hustle. But tonight, as he sat in the security room of the department store, his usual sense of calm had been replaced with an unease that he couldn't shake. The room was dim, the only light coming from the monitors that displayed the empty aisles and quiet corners of the store. The sound of his fingers tapping absent-mindedly against the desk filled the silence, but it did nothing to quiet the strange feeling that had settled in his chest. It wasn't just the loneliness of the late shift. No, this felt different. It started small, at first, with a slight flicker on one of the security cameras. Elliot had brushed it off as a glitch, something that could easily be fixed. But then it happened again, on a different camera. The screen blinked, distorting for a split second, showing nothing but static, and then returned to normal. A part of him dismissed it as just an issue with the feed, something that happened occasionally when the system was overworked, but as the night wore on, the glitches grew more frequent. It wasn't long before he found himself watching the cameras more intently, his gaze locked on the screens as the images seemed to pulse and flicker, like the store itself was alive, waiting. The odd thing was, the flickers never seemed to happen in the same places. Sometimes, they were in the far corners of the store, behind stacks of merchandise. Other times, they were right in the middle of the main aisles, as though something, or someone, was moving just beyond the range of the cameras. Elliot couldn't help but wonder if his mind was playing tricks on him. The store was empty, after all. There were no customers, no employees. It was just him and the stillness, and yet, it was as if something was watching him. He pushed the thought away, focusing on his job. Checking the footage, checking the security logs, making sure the store was secure. But every so often, he would glance up from the monitors, feeling an inexplicable sense of dread crawl up his spine. He couldn't explain it. He couldn't pinpoint it. But there was something off about the place tonight. It was as if the walls themselves were breathing, the store shifting and whispering beneath the surface. He sighed, rubbing his temples as he tried to refocus. "It's just paranoia," he muttered under his breath. "You're just tired, Elliot." But even as he tried to reassure himself, the feeling lingered. It was a gnawing sensation at the back of his mind, like the nagging of an instinct he couldn't quite put into words. He stood up and walked to the back of the security room, stepping into the narrow hallway that led to the stockroom. The silence seemed even more oppressive in the hallway, the air thick and heavy, pressing down on him. It was only the occasional hum of the overhead lights that reminded him he wasn't completely alone. But that didn't comfort him. The quiet was suffocating. He pushed open the door to the stockroom, the cold air hitting his skin like a slap. It smelled faintly of cardboard and dust, the air stale and unmoving. Elliot glanced around, scanning the aisles of supplies stacked neatly against the walls. Nothing seemed out of place. Still, he felt that prickle at the back of his neck, the sensation of being watched. He stepped further into the room, the door creaking shut behind him, and he immediately regretted it. The lights above flickered, casting an eerie, uneven glow over the shelves, and Elliot's heart skipped a beat. He spun around, half expecting someone to be standing right behind him, but there was no one there. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. It was just the lights. Just a malfunction. Nothing more. But as he turned back to the shelves, the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, a cold shiver creeping down his spine. It wasn't just the malfunctioning lights. Something felt wrong. The stillness in the air, the way the shelves loomed around him like silent sentinels, made him feel as though the space was closing in on him. He forced himself to take another step forward, but his movement was stiff, reluctant. Then, there it was. The unmistakable sound of a creaking floorboard. Elliot froze. His breath caught in his throat, and he spun around again, expecting to see someone standing in the doorway. But once again, the room was empty. The shelves were still, the lights flickering ominously overhead, but there was no one there. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing, but the fear had already begun to settle deep in his chest. The creaking sound was unmistakable, slow, deliberate, as if something heavy was being dragged across the floor. The sound seemed to come from behind one of the aisles, and Elliot's eyes darted to the far corner of the room. It was dark there, the shadows long and deep. But he could have sworn he saw movement. His heart pounded in his chest as he took a tentative step forward, the creaking growing louder, closer, with each movement he made. The shadows seemed to shift in the corner of his eye, and for a brief moment, Elliot thought he saw something. No, someone, standing in the dark. It was only for a fraction of a second, but it was enough to send a wave of panic through him. The room seemed to close in on him, the air thick and suffocating. "Hello." His voice broke through the silence, sounding small and distant in the vast emptiness of the stockroom. There was no answer. He took another step forward, closer to the source of the noise, but the closer he got, the heavier the air became. His feet seemed to move slower, as if weighed down by an invisible force. And then, just as he was about to reach the corner, the floor beneath him groaned, and a cold breeze swept through the room, carrying with it the faintest whisper. It wasn't a wind, there were no open windows. The air was still, stagnant. But the whisper lingered, just out of reach of his ears. His blood ran cold. The voice was low, almost imperceptible, but he could have sworn it was saying something. He stepped back, his pulse racing, the hair on his arms standing on end. "Who's there?" His voice was louder this time, trembling with unease. But once again, there was only silence. Elliot was about to turn and leave the stockroom, his feet already moving in the direction of the door, when a sound, something sharp, like a box scraping across the floor, made him freeze in place. He looked back. The shadows in the corner of the room had grown deeper, more defined. And then, just as quickly as the sound had started, everything fell silent again. But this time, the silence was different. It wasn't empty, it was heavy, suffocating. It was as though something had shifted in the air, something had entered the room that wasn't supposed to be there. Elliot's stomach twisted into a knot, and his instinct screamed at him to run, to get out, to leave the store and never look back. But his body refused to move, frozen in place by the overwhelming sense that whatever was in that room was waiting for him to make the first move. Then, without warning, the lights flickered again, this time much longer, casting the room into complete darkness for what felt like an eternity. When the lights returned, everything was the same, but nothing was the same. The shadows in the far corner had shifted again, and this time, the room felt smaller. The air was different. He could feel the presence now, tangible and suffocating, pressing against him from all sides. "Hello." Elliot's voice was barely a whisper, his throat tight with fear. But there was no response. Only the sound of his own breathing, ragged and shallow, echoing in the stillness. And then, a movement. Something shifted in the corner of his eye, something too fast to fully comprehend, but it was enough to make his blood run cold. The figure, a shadow, a blur of dark movement, was closer now, too close. The room had become a trap, and he was its prey. Amelia had never liked working alone, but she had learned to deal with it. Most nights, the hours passed slowly, the silence only broken by the occasional rustle of paper or the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. But tonight was different. The moment the door had clicked shut behind the last customer, she felt an unsettling change in the air. It was subtle at first, a shift she couldn't quite place, like the store itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore, it was oppressive, thick with an invisible tension. The long rows of shelves that lined the aisles seemed to loom taller than usual, the shadows beneath them stretching unnaturally long. She shook the feeling off, telling herself that she was just tired. It was late, after all, and working the graveyard shift alone often did strange things to her mind. Still, she couldn't help but glance over her shoulder as she made her way to the counter, as if expecting to see someone standing there, watching her. But there was nothing. The store was as empty as it had been when she first arrived. Her eyes lingered on the back door for a moment, the one leading out into the alley behind the building. It had been securely locked, but something about the way it stood there, still and unmoving, sent a shiver down her spine. She forced herself to focus on the task at hand, stocking the shelves, tidying up the front of the store. She could hear her own breathing, the soft shuffle of her feet on the tile floor, and the faint rustling sound of paper bags as she worked. The minutes passed in a slow crawl. The store had never felt so large, so empty, and she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she was being watched. Her heart rate quickened whenever she passed the dark aisles, the rows of merchandise seeming to whisper to her in the silence. But she told herself it was just her imagination. The shelves didn't move. The darkness wasn't alive. But then, it happened again. A soft thud, barely audible, came from the far end of the store. Amelia stopped in her tracks, her head snapping toward the sound. For a moment, there was nothing but the quiet hum of the lights and the distant sound of her own pulse in her ears. She waited, straining to hear anything that might explain the noise. But there was only silence, thick and suffocating. She shrugged it off as something falling from one of the shelves. The store was old, after all, and things had a tendency to shift over time. She made her way to the end of the aisle, moving carefully, her footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. When she reached the aisle where she thought she'd heard the noise, she found nothing out of place. No fallen boxes, no displaced items. Everything was exactly where it should have been. But the uneasy feeling remained, settled deep in her chest like a weight she couldn't shake. She stood still for a moment, listening, her eyes scanning the aisles. Nothing moved. Nothing spoke. And yet, the air felt wrong. It was too still, too quiet. That's when she heard it again. A soft shuffle of footsteps. Not the sound of shoes against the floor, but something else, distant, as if someone was moving carefully, trying to remain unnoticed. Amelia's heart leapt into her throat. She knew she was alone in the store. She had seen the last customer leave, watched the doors close behind them. There was no one else here. And yet, the sound was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was walking through the aisles. She took a few tentative steps forward, her eyes darting around the space, searching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. No one. The store was as empty as it had been moments ago. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing, trying to tell herself it was just her nerves. She was imagining things, that's all. It was just the isolation, the late hour. But even as she told herself this, she could feel the presence. It was there, just beyond the shelves, just out of sight. The footsteps came again, louder this time, closer. The sound echoed off the walls, bouncing around the store in an eerie rhythm. Amelia's heart began to race. She felt frozen in place, her body refusing to move, her mind unable to process what was happening. The footsteps grew closer, and she knew she had to do something. She couldn't stay here, in the middle of the store, waiting for whatever was moving in the shadows to find her. With a burst of adrenaline, she turned and ran. Her feet pounded against the floor as she made her way toward the back office, where the security monitors were. She reached the door and threw it open, rushing inside and locking it behind her. She leaned against the cool metal of the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her pulse pounding in her ears. She had to calm down. There was no one here. It was just her mind playing tricks on her, just the long hours getting to her. But then, she glanced at the monitor. The security feed showed the aisles in the front of the store, the dim glow of the fluorescent lights casting long shadows across the floor. For a moment, everything looked normal. The shelves were lined with merchandise, the aisles empty. But as she watched, she saw it, Movement in the corner of the screen. A figure, tall and thin, moving from one aisle to the next. It was a shadow, just a blur, but there was no mistaking it. Someone was in the store. Her breath caught in her throat. How was that possible? She was the only one here. The doors had been locked. There was no way anyone could have gotten in. The figure moved again, this time closer to the center of the store, its shape shifting in and out of the light. Amelia's hands trembled as she grabbed the walkie-talkie on the desk, her voice barely above a whisper as she spoke into it. "Hello? Is anyone there? Please, if you can hear me, help." There was no response. Only static. The figure on the monitor moved again, its outline becoming clearer with each passing second. It was standing still now, just in the middle of the aisle, and for a moment, Amelia could almost make out its features. It was a person, no doubt about it. A tall man, his face obscured by shadows, his posture unnaturally still. Her stomach turned. She had to get out. She had to leave. But before she could move, before she could make her way toward the door, the monitor flickered. The image distorted, the screen going black for a fraction of a second before coming back on. But the figure was gone. The aisle was empty again, just the shelves and the empty space between them. Amelia stared at the screen, her mind racing, her heart pounding in her chest. What the hell was going on? Her thoughts were interrupted by a loud bang, the sound echoing through the building, making her jump. It came from the back of the store, from the Starkrim, the door that led into the alley. Amelia's breath caught in her throat as she stood, frozen, her eyes wide. The door had slammed shut on its own. Then, the lights went out. The store plunged into darkness, and for a moment, there was nothing but the sound of her own breathing, shallow and quick. She reached for the flashlight on the desk, her hands shaking as she flicked it on. The beam of light cut through the dark, illuminating the walls of the office, the door behind her, the small corner of the room she had never noticed before. And then, she saw it. A figure, standing in the doorway. Tall, thin, and unmistakably human. Its face was obscured by shadow, but the shape was all too familiar. It was the same figure she had seen on the monitor, the one who had been moving through the aisles. The one who wasn't supposed to be here. The light flickered once more, and the figure took a step forward. Amelia's breath caught in her throat, her body frozen in fear. The darkness around her seemed to press in, suffocating her, trapping her in this nightmare. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. But the figure didn't answer. It didn't move either. It simply stood there, staring at her from the shadows. The silence stretched, unbearable, until the figure stepped forward again. And this time, Amelia knew, there was no way out. Jason had been working the night shift for years, and in all that time, he had never encountered anything quite like this. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the occasional beeping of the checkout registers, and the soft shuffling of his feet on the tile floor were familiar, comforting even. But tonight, something was different. It wasn't just the store that felt off, it was the air itself, thick and oppressive, like something was weighing down on him, pressing against him from all sides. He felt it as soon as he walked in, the moment the door clicked shut behind him, the sound reverberating in the silence. The store, once bustling with customers during the day, now felt empty in a way that made him uneasy. Not the usual emptiness of a closing time, but something deeper, something that gnawed at his bones. Jason rubbed his eyes, hoping to shake the feeling, but it lingered, settling into the pit of his stomach. He had learned to ignore the late-night quiet, to embrace it even. But tonight, the stillness seemed more like a warning than a lullaby. The hum of the cooling units above him seemed too loud, too constant. He couldn't focus on the mundane tasks in front of him. His mind kept wandering to the security cameras, to the small glitches he had noticed on the monitors earlier, brief flickers, distortions that had no reason to exist. At first, he had thought it was a technical issue, maybe the feed cutting out momentarily. But as the night wore on, the glitches became more frequent, more pronounced. It was as if the very fabric of the store was unraveling. Jason sighed, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that was creeping up his spine. He grabbed the walkie-talkie clipped to his belt and pressed the button, trying to reach anyone, but there was no response, just static. His grip tightened around the device, his brow furrowed. The walkie-talkie had been acting up all night. It had a tendency to cut out at random, leaving him with nothing but a blank screen and the hollow buzz of white noise. He tried again, but this time, there was a strange crackling sound on the other end. "Jason," a voice crackled through, distorted and broken. It was his manager, but it sounded like she was speaking from a great distance. "Jason, can you hear me?" "Yeah, I hear you," Jason replied, his voice barely above a whisper. He glanced around, feeling a chill spread through him. The voice seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, but no one was here. The store was still. Dead quiet. "Jason," the voice echoed again, and then, as if cut off by something unseen, the transmission went dead. A burst of static filled the air, louder than before, as if something was moving just beyond the static, something trying to get through, something he couldn't quite understand. Jason stood still, the walkie-talkie slipping from his hand. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the racing beat of his heart, but the tension in his chest only grew. His mind kept circling back to the cameras, to the glitches, to the strange feeling of being watched, though no one else was around. He moved toward the security room, the dim lighting casting long shadows that stretched and contorted with every step he took. The room felt colder now, the walls pressing in on him, the shadows growing darker with each passing second. The fluorescent lights above flickered once more, a harsh strobe that made Jason wince. He reached the door to the security office and paused, a feeling of unease washing over him. For a brief moment, he considered turning back, but the thought was quickly dismissed. He had to see it. He had to know if something was wrong, if he wasn't just imagining things. The door creaked as it swung open, revealing the rows of monitors on the desk, their screens displaying the empty aisles of the store. Jason walked in, taking a seat in front of the monitors, his eyes scanning the footage. The screens flickered briefly, then steadied, showing the usual array of images: empty aisles, abandoned shopping carts, shelves lined with products. But then something caught his eye, a movement on the far side of the store. At first, he thought it was just another glitch, another distortion in the feed, but as he focused, the image became clearer. A shadow, tall and thin, standing at the edge of the camera's view. It was only for a moment, barely a blink, but Jason saw it. He leaned forward, his breath catching in his throat. The shadow was still there, lingering, barely visible, but unmistakably there. It wasn't the flicker of a malfunction. This was something else. His heart pounded in his chest as he sat frozen, staring at the screen. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there, still as death, waiting. His hands were trembling as he reached for the mouse, trying to shift the camera's view, but when he clicked, the image didn't change. The shadow remained locked in place. Jason's stomach twisted into knots. Something was wrong. He had to find out what it was. With a sense of dread creeping up his spine, Jason stood up and grabbed the flashlight from the desk drawer. The beam of light cut through the darkened office, casting sharp shadows on the walls as he moved toward the door. The air felt thick and heavy, pressing in on him as he stepped back out into the store. He hesitated, his breath shallow, before making his way down the narrow aisle toward the section where he had seen the shadow. His footsteps echoed loudly in the quiet, each step seeming to amplify the growing tension in the air. He turned the corner, his flashlight casting a pool of light on the shelves ahead of him. The aisle was empty. Nothing but rows of neatly stacked products, their labels staring back at him in the faint glow of his flashlight. But the feeling of being watched hadn't dissipated. It had only grown stronger, more pressing. His pulse quickened as he walked deeper into the aisle, his eyes darting from side to side, searching for any sign of movement. Then, the lights above him flickered again. This time, it wasn't just a brief flash. It was a strobe, fast and erratic, casting everything into momentary darkness before illuminating the store in harsh, flickering light. Jason's heart skipped a beat as the shadows around him twisted, distorted, and for a brief moment, the aisle seemed to warp, as though the entire space was shifting, bending around him. He stumbled back, trying to steady himself, his mind racing with confusion. What was happening? The flickering stopped, and for a split second, everything was still again. Jason's breath caught in his throat as he noticed something, a figure standing at the end of the aisle, facing him. A man, tall and thin, his features obscured by shadows. His face was hidden in the darkness, but the figure stood perfectly still, as though waiting for something or someone. Jason took a step back, his body shaking with fear. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was paralyzed, his mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. He wanted to run. He wanted to get out, to flee to safety, but his legs wouldn't move. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the figure, and as he stared, the figure slowly turned, its body contorting unnaturally, as if it wasn't quite human. Jason's breath hitched, and his mind screamed at him to leave, but his body refused to obey. The figure took a step forward, its movements jerky, unnatural, and Jason's heart pounded in his chest. He finally found his voice, calling out, "Who are you?" His voice cracked, echoing in the vast emptiness of the store. But the figure didn't answer. It didn't move, didn't acknowledge him. It just stood there, as if it was waiting for something. Then, without warning, the lights went out again. The store plunged into darkness, and the oppressive silence was deafening. Jason's breath came in shallow gasps as he stood frozen in the dark, his mind racing, his body trembling with fear. He couldn't see anything. He couldn't hear anything. All he could feel was the overwhelming presence of the figure, lingering just beyond his reach, like it was still there, watching him. And in that suffocating darkness, the fear crept in, cold and unrelenting. The silence stretched, unbearable, until it was broken by a soft sound, a faint, slow scraping, like something dragging across the floor. Jason's pulse raced as he tried to orient himself in the dark. The scraping grew louder, closer, and in the pit of his stomach, he knew the figure was moving toward him. He reached for the flashlight, his hands trembling uncontrollably, but before he could turn it on, a voice, soft and low, whispered from the shadows. "You shouldn't have come." And then, nothing. Sarah had always prided herself on being prepared, on keeping a calm head in even the most chaotic situations. She was the kind of person who could manage a customer complaint with ease, who could juggle the demands of a busy store without breaking a sweat. But tonight, as she stood in the middle of the store, alone after hours, she felt far from composed. The feeling had crept up on her slowly, a sense of unease that had gradually taken hold, gnawing at the edges of her mind. It started with the flickering lights, barely noticeable at first, like the store was breathing in time with her. Then there were the strange noises, soft, barely audible sounds that seemed to come from nowhere, and yet, the longer she stood still, the more pronounced they became. A shuffle here, a creak there. The sound of something moving in the shadows. She had thought it was just her imagination, that she was tired, that working the late shift alone had made her hyper-aware of every little noise. But as the hours dragged on, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. It wasn't paranoia, or at least she didn't think it was. There was something in the air tonight, something heavy and thick, like the entire store was holding its breath. She glanced over at the security monitors on the wall, the familiar faces of the cameras staring back at her. The feeds were all normal, empty aisles, the soft light of the store illuminating the shelves. Everything was as it should be. And yet, something about it all felt wrong. She stood there for a moment, her eyes locked on the screens, but the unease only deepened. The store felt alive, but not in a good way. It was like it was waiting for something, watching her, its walls closing in on her. Sarah shook her head and forced herself to turn away from the monitors, her mind telling her that it was just the isolation getting to her. She walked through the aisles, her steps quick and purposeful, trying to focus on the task at hand, on stocking the shelves, on doing something, anything, to keep her mind from wandering back to the odd sense of discomfort that seemed to permeate the space around her. It was as she was sorting through the boxes in the back corner that she heard it again, a soft thud, followed by the faint scraping sound. This time, it was closer. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she froze, her hands trembling slightly as she held the box. The store was quiet again, too quiet, and the sound lingered in the air like a whisper that wouldn't quite go away. She strained her ears, waiting, but there was nothing more. No footsteps. No movement. Just the silence. For a moment, Sarah tried to brush it off. She wasn't alone, there was no way she could be. She checked the door to the storage room again, ensuring it was still locked. The security systems were all functioning. There were no signs of forced entry. And yet, the feeling persisted, an invisible weight pressing down on her chest. She took a deep breath and tried to push it all away. She wasn't some nervous rookie. She was a professional. She had done this job countless times without incident. There was nothing here to be afraid of. But the unease was unrelenting. Her hands shook as she picked up another box, this time more carefully, trying to steady herself. She glanced at the security cameras again, but the flickering of the lights had returned, and the monitors seemed to distort for just a moment, as if the store itself was glitching. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, but when she looked again, everything was back to normal. She wasn't sure what made her turn around, but the moment she did, her blood ran cold. The store aisle she had just walked through was darker than it should have been, the shadows deeper, stretching far beyond what the lights should have allowed. The cold air was thick, swirling around her in an unsettling way. And in the distance, at the far end of the aisle, something moved. It wasn't a person. It wasn't a shadow either. It was something else, something that defied logic, like a wisp of darkness itself, twisting and bending in ways that didn't make sense. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she thought she had imagined it, but then the darkness moved again, shifting slightly, almost as if it were alive. She stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to move. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her body wouldn't respond. The dark figure stretched and pulled, growing longer, more defined, until it was standing there, at the end of the aisle, just beyond the edge of the light. She could make out the outline of a figure, though no details, no face, no features, just the silhouette of something tall and far too thin to be human. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She knew she should turn and run. She knew that the safest thing would be to get as far away from whatever this was as possible. But something kept her there. Something in the back of her mind, a voice telling her that if she moved, it would notice her. If she ran, she would draw its attention. And she couldn't bring herself to risk it. For a moment, the figure didn't move. It was still, silent, as though it was watching her, waiting for something. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. One moment, there, towering at the edge of her vision, and the next, it had disappeared into the shadows, as though it had never been there at all.